Welcome to this exclusive operational briefing. Listen, today we are definitely not just talking about stockpiling canned goods or buying a bunker. Instead, we're stepping into the role of tactical survival consultants to map out the psychological architecture you and your family actually need to survive what experts call a black sky event. We're talking about a total, prolonged grid collapse. In this explainer, we're going to dig right into the hard, clinical science of survival, drawing from NASA spaceflight data, polar expedition research, and tactical urban evasion.
Most people will not be able to adapt to the absence of 4G coverage, an ATM card that no longer works, and no available double whip lattes. All should be suspect. Now that quote, that is a stark, massive wake-up call for us. We live in a society with an extreme, almost dangerous reliance on modern technology. I mean, our environment is perfectly climate-controlled, and our biggest daily crisis is usually a delayed food delivery or, a messed-up double whip latte. Because of that extreme comfort, our innate evolutionary ability to adapt to sudden isolation and deprivation has severely atrophied. When those comforts literally vanish, the cold, biological reality of survival sets in. And the folks who haven't prepared mentally, they are going to be the absolute first to panic.
So, here's our briefing dossier for today. We'll be looking at the illusion of modern safety, the anatomy of behavioral resilience, the 4 waves of resilience research, surviving the discomfort period, tactical invisibility, and finally, becoming the architect of your own survival.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the illusion of modern safety, where we'll look at the immediate, cascading threats that hit the second the utility grid abruptly collapses.
Okay, let's look at this grim reality. Imagine you live in a high-density apartment. Within the first 30 days of a total grid failure, your biggest enemy isn't necessarily other people right out of the gate, it's literally physics and biology. When municipal water pressure fails, you're immediately facing dehydration and a massive risk of waterborne pathogens, as people inevitably turn to unsafe sources. When waste removal stops, we see an exponential rise in disease vectors like cholera and dysentery within those tight residential footprints. And when climate control completely fails in modern glass-heavy buildings, residents face extreme thermal stress. We're talking severe hypothermia or heat stroke, often within just 72 hours.
Think about this stark contrast for a second. On one side, we have our modern dependency. It is incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on a complex web of running water and daily digital logistics that can and will vanish in an instant. On the other side, we have our innate adaptation. This is your biological survival toolkit. Thermal regulation, physical endurance, and maintaining your psychosocial balance. Listen, all the tactical gear in the world will absolutely not save you if your psychological shield shatters under the weight of this harsh new reality.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the anatomy of behavioral resilience. To really understand how humans survive extreme deprivation, we're going to turn to NASA's foundational framework from isolated, confined, and extreme, or ICE, environments.
Okay, let's dive into this. NASA's research reveals that survival in these icy environments is definitely not just about luck. It's actually the manifestation of a robust behavioral architecture, a nomological network designed to stop you from mentally eroding. Subject matter experts basically break this down into 2 primary operational modes. The first is sustained functioning. This is your ability to maintain psychological homeostasis and mission efficiency despite the everyday, chronic grind. In isolated environments, this means managing what they call the monotony of the void. The ambient noise, the total lack of privacy, and just the repetitive nature of staying alive without basic infrastructure. The second mode is bouncing back. This is the acute recovery phase. After a sudden catastrophe or a high-impact trauma, like a total equipment failure, you have to instantly deploy a cache of psychological and physiological resources to prevent a permanent collapse in your functioning.
Moving right along to Section 3, the 4 waves of research. We're going to see exactly how clinical science has decoded this survival mindset over the years.
And this brilliantly illustrates how our clinical understanding of resilience has completely transformed. It's not just some fixed personality trait you're either born with or not. In Generation 1, scientists really just looked at trait identification to try and differentiate survivors from non-survivors. But then, in Generation 2, they looked at interactive processes, how protective factors like having a sense of humor or really strong social support help mediate the relationship between adversity and adaptation. Generation 3 brought us intervention mastery, meaning we realized we can actually develop specific training to intentionally build this resilience. And finally, the current era is diving into our biological foundations, looking at genetic and neurological markers like dopamine receptor variants, which actually dictate our inherent biological stress ceilings. So the takeaway here, resilience is dynamic, and you can absolutely forge it intentionally.
Next up is Section 4, Surviving the Discomfort Period. We are going to prepare you for the darkest part of isolation, that crucial phase where the novelty fades away and sheer biological depletion sets in.
Hard data from NASA's simulated Mars missions reveals a very distinct timeline of biological depletion. When an ordeal first begins, you hit initial adaptation. Your stress is high, sure, but it's actually eustress, elevated stress hormones driven by the sheer novelty of the emergency. You're hyper-alert and active. But then, inevitably comes the deprivation phase. This is the chronic lull. Your brain physically changes during this time, showing heavily decreased dopamine and serotonin levels. And finally, if things don't improve, you hit the disruption phase. This is characterized by high volatility, where your sleep and activity cycles just completely fall apart.
So, the absolute crucial point here is recognizing this defined phase, what's known in the literature as the third quarter phenomenon. Past the halfway point of your ordeal, when that initial adrenaline is completely gone, but the finish line is still nowhere in sight, your morale plummets. You experience severe difficulties in mood and crazy levels of interpersonal tension. If you are locked down with your family during a grid collapse, warning them about this predictable slump ahead of time is absolutely essential. It is a biological reality of confinement, folks, not a personal failing. Navigating it with empathy is exactly what keeps the unit together.
To survive that deep deprivation phase, humans will sometimes adopt what is known as psychological hibernation. Researchers studying overwintering crews down in Antarctica observed this mild fugue state, and they often call it the Antarctic stare. It's actually an adaptive state where you subconsciously seek reduced stimulation and experience a sort of emotional flatness. Essentially, your brain is switching off to conserve vital mental energy during the crushing monotony of a collapsed environment. It acts as an internal shield, allowing you to engage with the external world without being completely consumed by its chaos.
All right, let's pivot the briefing slightly for Section 5. We've built your internal psychological shield. Now we really need to talk about external physical survival and navigating a desperate public through tactical invisibility.
I want you to seriously ask yourself this question. When disaster strikes and you are the only one prepared, what will everyone around you be doing? The answer is pretty simple. They will be panicking. In a state of total grid failure, desperation sets in incredibly fast. Hunger and thirst make people wildly unpredictable and highly dangerous. So the absolute last thing you want is to be singled out as the one person who has food, water, and a solid plan. To avoid becoming a target out there, you need to understand the reticular activating system, or RAS. This is a network in the human brain that conserves energy by ignoring ordinary, everyday baseline details. But the RAS will instantly flag anything that is faster, louder, brighter, or just out of place. If you walk out into a disaster zone looking heavily geared up with a tactical backpack and a confident stride, you will immediately trigger the RAS of every single desperate person around you. You literally turn yourself into a flashing lighthouse.
To counter this, you must execute what survival experts call gray man mobility. Number 1, keep moving. Do not stop and draw attention unless your immediate task absolutely demands it. Number 2, blend in. You must appear entirely ordinary, completely uninteresting, and just as exhausted as the general public. Hide your supplies beneath unassuming everyday clothing. And number 3, plan ahead. Know every single corner of your route so you can maintain total autonomy and fluid mobility without ever looking like you're navigating or leading. You are actively manipulating the psychology of the crowd to achieve absolute tactical invisibility.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 6, the Architect of Survival. It's time to issue the final directives for this briefing, empowering you to take absolute control of your immediate physical reality.
Consider this a mental palate cleanser, because we need a crucial shift in perspective here. You must transition from being a passive resident to an active biological habitat operator. You're no longer just living in an apartment or a house. The very moment the grid fails, your home becomes a closed-loop survival habitat, and you are its sole engineer.
Operating a survival habitat requires absolute clinical discipline. As the operator, you have to master the thermodynamics of your specific shelter, knowing exactly how to insulate against the freezing cold or vent deadly heat. You have to understand the chemistry of water purification because the tap is completely dead. You must manage the strict empirical logistics of your own waste to prevent horrific outbreaks of dysentery. And above all else, you have to forge that internal shield of psychosocial protective factors, maintaining optimism, emotional regulation, and deep social trust within your family unit. Synthesizing this clinical physical discipline with your psychological resilience is the only true way to endure long-term infrastructure collapse.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a lingering provocative thought. When the grid fails and that long, crushing, monotonous void sets in, will your family's behavioral shield actually hold? Survival, as we've seen, is not just a fixed trait. It's a dynamic process of adaptation, and it's one that you have to start building today. Take these clinical frameworks, build your behavioral architecture, and ensure that when the black sky event finally happens, you are the architect of your own survival. Thanks for joining this briefing. Keep learning, keep preparing, and stay resilient out there.